All right, 132, folks. We're still talking about what's happening in Unit 3. We're still talking about this last chapter, chapter 20, and what's important about it. We've been talking about progressivism, and I was talking about Teddy Roosevelt's stand on progressivism. There's something else you have to talk about. Is we talked about the involvement of Christian societies in this with the YWCA and the YMCA and their push towards the idea of Christianity, social crisis, the idea of working, but also there's another movement that's combined, and that is women's suffrage and temperance. What we look at in this is the rise of Susan B. Anthony, the rise of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Women's suffrage is about letting women vote, allowing women to vote, giving them finally the right to be able to vote, because they have largely been silenced up to this particular point. But what's also happening is we're linking this, sometimes willingly, sometimes unwillingly, to the temperance movement and the women's Christian temperance movement. You see Frances Willard's name pop up in here. And what the temperance movement is a movement against alcohol and alcohol consumption. And so we start to look at the Anti-Saloon League. We start to look at the push for a Prohibition amendment to the Constitution, because they feel like drinking and alcohol is linked to the mistreatment of women, that it's linked to the social ills, that it's linked to poverty, that people are wasting money on alcohol and liquor when it could be used to improving society. When men go out and drink, not only do they waste their money, but apparently they have a tendency to come home and be violent. Now, obviously, those are proven by now standards along the way, but what they're trying to do back then is really prove this and act upon this. And so there's a huge prohibition movement. Some of the ladies' societies, women's societies, are happy with linking the two together. Some are definitely unhappy with the link together. But we're pushing not only for the women's vote or right to vote, but we're also pushing to kind of limit prohibition. Prohibition is going to come around before the right for women to vote does. And so it's important to know that as much as people want to complain about prohibition and what was done to them, hey, the women weren't voting at that point, so the men effectively did it to themselves. I do have to say that just because women don't have the legal right to vote doesn't mean they don't actually have input on society, they don't actually have input on the laws. Many of them are influencing their husbands and their brothers on, how to vote on that as well. The other thing that we see pop up at this point, and you have to remember, what we're looking at with this industrialization, what we're looking at with this movement is we're creating industries, we're creating mechanization, we're creating a system where you're going to have a guy named Frederick Winslow Taylor. Frederick Winslow Taylor is going to create a system called Taylorism, and what it is, it's a gospel of efficiency. What we're going to see is how to create not quite lines, but how to create systems in factories to better manufacture, to cut down the amount of waste in time, and how to make the manufacture of things more efficient at this particular point. And it's huge because part of that system is mechanization. Part of that system is how we power it. One of the things that's unfortunate about this time was we also see a huge rise in the employment of children, small children especially. Hey, I don't know if you've ever been in a factory or not, but having worked in a textile mill, having worked in a furniture mill, having worked in a variety of factories along the way before I started teaching full-time, I know that they have lots of moving, spinning machines. And here's the thing, things get stuck in the machines, things clog parts in the machines, things get in the way and slow down production. And so the machines have to be cleaned. Well, there's two ways of doing it. Either A, shutting the machine down and cleaning it out, which means you're not producing at that point, which is affecting efficiency, or you hire small people with little tiny hands to go in while the machines are working to help clean out the parts and keep things efficient. It works much better. Unfortunately, when you have lots of spinning gears and you have small hands, there's going to be a loss. There's going to be a loss of limb. There's going to be a loss of life. And so a lot of things are happening at this point. We're going to have a push. And this is important because when we start talking about the women's movement, about the Christian temperance movement, we start talking about the National Women's Suffrage Association, women are starting to affect also the labor movement. And the labor movement is huge here because what's going to happen is we're going to see a push towards how we do hiring, about how we do what jobs. And so with this push in populism, we're going to start talking about things like a 40-hour work week. We're going to start talking about certain jobs being appropriate for females, certain jobs being inappropriate for small children. And we're going to try to create some standards. One of the huge things that comes up at this time, the book talks about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Folks, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is horrific because we're talking about a sweatshop. We're talking about being way up in an old building. We're talking about extension cords hanging from light fixtures to make sewing machines run. We're talking about stairwells that are stacked full of product. We're talking about people who are creating a working environment that is unsafe. Imagine being watched over your entire 10 to 12 hour shift to make sure that you don't take a break and waste time away from production with things like, bodily functions. This is what's happening, and what happens is this. It's a very unsafe environment, this textile sweatshop, where women are doing the sewing, and it's women that are doing the sewing because it turns out women are better at small, delicate jobs like sewing shirts. And what will happen is there is a spark, there's a short in the faulty wiring, and a fire is going to start. Well, because some of the doors are chained shut, because some of the stairways are stacked up with flammable goods, there's going to be horrific loss of life. Literally, you will have women jumping from windows. It is better to be killed in the fall than it is to be burned to death. Well, what that does is it creates the opportunity for change. It creates the opportunity to pass some progressive government changes about, what's right and what's wrong in employment, what is legal, what age it's legal to hire somebody at, what kind of jobs they can and can't do. And so it's a change in labor and safety laws, and that's huge. This is also where the National Child Labor Committee come in, where the National Consumers League comes in, because it talks about a white label drive. And the idea being is we're not union here, but we're going to have a push by the National Consumers League that says, hey, listen, this was manufactured under safe conditions. This was manufactured under this conditions, and we're going to allow them to put this white label in that shows what kind of condition it was. And it's huge because this is part of that same movement. And the idea that it comes under the heading of where the women's push is towards power is that women are perhaps a bit more nurturing, that women are perhaps paying a bit more attention to some of the finer nurturing aspects. All right, this is a big part, this women's movement, and it continues to push, and this is a huge part of the progressive movement, so keep that in mind. Now, I want to talk about one more thing, because we're looking at the introduction at this point of a couple of new amendments. We're looking at a change in politics and government, and that's huge, but I don't want to start here because there's not enough time, so I'm going to go ahead and close this out and do one more video for this unit, and we're done.